July of 2000. In the serene summer waters off the eastern shores of the Canadian province of Newfoundland, a sight unseen there for a millennium emerged on the horizon, an impressive fleet of warships. As part of a grand celebration marking 1,000 years since the Viking discovery of North America, over a dozen meticulously recreated replicas of Viking vessels had undertaken a long voyage from their ancestral Scandinavia. Their ultimate destination was Lanceaux Meadows, the only confirmed Viking colony in the Western Hemisphere, located at the northern tip of Newfoundland. As these majestic ships slowly entered the cove, the assembled crowd greeted their arrival with jubilant cheers and joyful welcomes. 1,000 years prior, however, the approach of such ships would have elicited a starkly different, chilling reaction. The moment a Viking ship appeared on the horizon, an ominous cry would have echoed across the waves. "Beware, boys. The Vikings are coming." Who were these enigmatic Vikings, and what compelled them to undertake such distant voyages to the very edges of the known world? The term Viking originates from the Old Norse word vik, meaning bay, indicating their deep connection to the sea and coastal areas. These fearless seafarers first made their mark on the bustling trade routes of northern Europe in the 7th century AD. Their original homeland was the rugged yet picturesque Scandinavian lands now known as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. These vast expanses were covered in dense forests and crowned by towering mountains, only occasionally interrupted by deep, winding sea inlets, the famous fjords. It was from these sheltered natural harbors that the Norsemen of the 8th century first ventured forth on their daring expeditions, initiating an era that would forever transform the face of Europe. But what drove them to such extensive expansion? A confluence of interconnected factors propelled the people of the Viking Age into risky endeavors. One key element was undoubtedly a significant improvement in climatic conditions. By the 7th century, ice sheets worldwide began to recede, and the planet gradually warmed, providing a longer growing season in the north. This led to a rapid population increase, creating an excess of people in a confined area and, consequently, fierce competition for vital resources within Scandinavia. Simultaneously, Viking shipbuilders achieved a truly revolutionary technological breakthrough. The foundation of their unprecedented success appears to have been the invention of a fundamentally new type of vessel that surpassed all previous designs in speed and maneuverability. Historians first uncovered irrefutable evidence of such advanced ships in April 1880. This occurred on a farm located high above the Oslo Fjord, near the quiet village of Gokstad. A curious farmer began excavating a massive earthen mound on his land, popularly known as the King's Mound. Local legends claimed that a powerful Viking chieftain was buried beneath it with all his untold treasures. Archaeologists, continuing the farmer's work, were astonished to discover a remarkably well-preserved Viking ship that had been intentionally interred. Scientific dating precisely placed this burial at approximately 850 AD, coinciding with the dawn of the Viking Age itself. On board the ship, inside a tent covered with a thick layer of clay, the excavators found the remains of a Viking chieftain, buried with all the provisions and tools believed necessary for a warrior in the afterlife. However, the most significant and valuable find was the ship itself. Measurements showed it reached an impressive 76 feet, about 23 meters, from bow to stern, and was skillfully crafted from solid oak. The Gokstad ship represented a colossal leap in shipbuilding, becoming the pinnacle of engineering for its time. No other maritime culture of that era could build such a fast yet incredibly strong vessel. Its robust construction and shallow draft made it extraordinarily effective, capable of effortlessly crossing vast oceans and then silently ascending shallow rivers, penetrating deep into the heart of the continent. As their shipbuilding technologies advanced, the Vikings were able to apply their sophisticated rules and navigational tools to traverse previously unimaginable distances. The type of vessel found at Gokstad is an early example of a warship. Ultimately, the Vikings developed this design into a formidable new weapon that terrified entire nations. These ships could swiftly approach the shore, unleash an attack, and then disappear just as quickly and tracelessly, like ghosts. 793 AD. On the small island of Lindisfarne, located off the eastern coast of England, the monks of St. Cuthbert's Monastery were engaged in their daily, measured routines. Nothing forewarned of danger. Suddenly, from the sea, from an element they had always considered protective and peace-giving, came the greatest threat they had ever known. A powerful, unstoppable force from the north descended upon them. The barbarians furiously plundered everything in their path, killing not only livestock, sheep, and oxen, but also mercilessly slaughtering monks and nuns. Monasteries were richly endowed with ecclesiastical objects and utensils, crosses, reliquaries, all kinds of richly adorned jewels, gold, and silver artifacts. These treasures were the Vikings' primary target. The attack on Lindisfarne was the first, deafening salvo of a 200-year Viking onslaught on the Western world, heralding an era of fear and destruction. From the British Isles to the boundless steppes of Russia, from the powerful Holy Roman Empire to Moorish North Africa, no kingdom, no city was safe from this pagan, ruthless invasion. Europe, it seemed, was succumbing to the Viking onslaught. On Easter Sunday, 845, the Vikings triumphantly entered Paris, which was left undefended and mercilessly plundered. It is important to note that the common image of Vikings in horned helmets is actually a widespread myth. This image was likely popularized by set designers working on Richard Wagner's operas in the 19th century. The attack on the English monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 marks the true beginning of the full-scale Viking offensive, drawn by the immense wealth of Christian Europe. The beginning of the Viking Age coincided with Charlemagne's reign in northern Europe. The scholar Alcuin, an English monk serving at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, nor was such a landing from the sea thought possible." Charlemagne deliberately and consciously fortified the continent's defenses against Viking attacks and managed to maintain a system that prevented serious Viking invasions on the continent. However, after his death in 814, his son, Louis the Pious, proved less vigilant and cautious. Soon, Viking ships became a common, terrifying sight along the entire northern coast of France and in the British Isles. Attacks were frequent, and their main advantage was surprise. They were unparalleled masters of lightning-fast, hit-and-run raids, leaving behind only devastation and fear. In 845, an impressive Viking fleet of 120 ships, commanded by the Danish chieftain Ragnar, also known as Ragnar Lothbrok due to his large, woolly, awe-inspiring clothes, ascended the River Seine. Their target was the fertile agricultural lands located in the Marne Valley, outside Paris. Ragnar, in the truest sense, embodied the Viking archetype. He was a daredevil, a valiant warrior, and a tireless adventurer. King Charles the Bald immediately assembled his troops and rushed to intercept the Scandinavian invaders. However, as the magnificent Norse fleet approached, Charles acted rashly, attempting to defend both banks of the river, thereby effectively dividing his forces in two. The Vikings effortlessly crushed the smaller of the French armies, capturing over 100 men. Then, to deliver a ruthless lesson in their martial prowess, Ragnar publicly hanged the captives in full view of their comrades. Subsequently, the Vikings met no resistance as they advanced towards their rich spoils. And so, on Easter Sunday, 845, Ragnar entered Paris unopposed, a city left undefended and destined for plunder. In a desperate attempt to save the capital, Charles offered to pay silver in exchange for the Vikings' departure. This was the first of many payments known as Danegeld, which literally translates to Danish money or payment, and expressed the principle, if they cannot be defeated militarily, they should be bought off. For this, Ragnar was given a substantial sum of 7,000 pounds of silver. King Charles the Bald agreed to this payment on the condition that Ragnar would not return. However, such a strategy was doomed to fail, as it only encouraged the raiders to return again and again. If payments were delayed or not made, the Vikings severely punished their victims, for example, by cutting their muscles. Nevertheless, some well-organized forces were able to successfully resist Viking aggression. After plundering Seville, the main city of Moorish Spain, the Vikings suffered a crushing defeat. The Moors fought back fiercely, hurling fireballs at the Viking fleet on the Guadalquivir River, resulting in the sinking of 30 ships. So many Norsemen were captured by the Moors that Seville's gallows could not accommodate them all. The rest were hanged directly on the city's date palms. However, for the most part, the Vikings remained unstoppable. By the end of the 9th century, they were raiding cities across the Mediterranean, even reaching Constantinople. In the early 10th century, the Vikings secured their sole and permanent foothold in Western Europe. In 911, a massive armada of Viking ships landed at the mouth of the River Seine. This invasion was led by a Viking chieftain known as Rollo the Walker, who earned this nickname due to his exceptional physique, which no horse could carry. Unable to repel them, the French king decided to offer the Norsemen a treaty, ceding land to them in exchange for their protection against other Viking attacks. Under this treaty, Rollo, as he came to be known in France, agreed to convert to Christianity in exchange for settling territories at the mouth of the Seine. The new kingdom, destined to become one of the most powerful in Europe, derived its name from the French term for Vikings, Normans, or Normandy. By 912, Rollo and his men had fulfilled their part of the agreement, embracing the Christian faith. However, the original Norse way of life did not take root here. The Vikings displayed an astonishing ability to assimilate quickly. Those who ventured abroad on ships, especially to seize land by force in England, France, and similar places, were primarily young men, and they took local women as wives. Within just a few decades, even the Scandinavian language was almost forgotten, but the descendants of the Vikings' thirst for conquest did not wane. The Viking conquest of England left behind an indelible legacy. One manifestation of this was a dispute resolution system where two parties presented their arguments through 12 chosen representatives. In other parts of the world, around the year 1000, in Norway, King Olaf decreed that all lands under his rule, including Iceland, officially adopt Christianity. In Italy, the musician Guido of Arezzo invented parallel lines, known in music as the musical staff. And in China, alchemists developed an early version of gunpowder, intended for fireworks. The modern city of York, located in northern England, boasts an ancient heritage. The Romans once favored this site as an excellent military base due to its naturally protected position. Today, York's architecture predominantly reflects a grander English tradition, yet upon closer inspection, clear evidence of a Viking presence can be found. In 865, England faced a true Norse nightmare. Along the eastern coast, on unprotected shores, a Viking invasion army of 2,000 men, known as the Great Heathen Army, landed. The Vikings were led by three brothers. Their father had been killed by Aella, the Anglo-Saxon ruler of York. Legend has it that the brothers attacked York in revenge for Aella's killing of their father, who, according to legend, was thrown into a snake pit. Within a year, the Viking army marched on the only developing city, which the English called Eoforwic, York. In a fierce battle, they not only captured the city but also its ruler, King Aella. Legend claims the brothers avenged him by performing the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle was one of the most brutal execution methods, where the Vikings would cut the ribs on the victim's back and expose the lungs, which would then be inflated to mimic an eagle's wings in flight. After the conquest, the Vikings embarked on a large-scale reconstruction and rebuilding of the subjugated settlement, giving it the Scandinavian name Jorvik. Over several centuries, the Norsemen evidently had a significant impact, radically changing the city's appearance. They actively developed the area outside the ancient Roman fortress, particularly the area now known as Coppergate. It is in this district that numerous and most important archaeological artifacts dating back to the Viking Age have been discovered. In 1968, the York Archaeological Trust was founded with the aim of studying and preserving the city's historical sites. Richard Hall was one of its founders. Approximately 30 years ago, when a local bank planned to construct new vaults, archaeologists proposed preliminary excavations on the site. These relatively small investigations unearthed a completely new world of Norse artifacts. Soon, subsequent archaeological work in York revealed even more compelling evidence of the city's Viking past. Buildings erected during the Viking rule were found, proving to be among the best preserved structures of that era ever discovered in Britain. Scandinavian artisans and craftsmen lived and worked in cramped quarters. The refuse and waste they trampled into the earthen floors were preserved, becoming a unique imprint of their daily lives and crafts. Among them were blacksmiths who made knives, tools, and certain types of weapons. Leatherworkers created shoes. Textile manufacturers produced various garments. There were also traders who imported silk from Byzantium and engaged in making headwear and caps, which were fashionable in 10th century York. Thus, they earned their living. The Vikings abandoned raiding expeditions and focused on production and trade. In addition to residential structures, archaeologists discover ancient refuse pits, known as middens. These deposits contain countless archaeological finds. From the remains of animal bones, seeds, and other organic materials, researchers gain extensive knowledge about the diet and farming methods of the time. One can also glean insights into their health. For instance, it is known that residents suffered from intestinal infections. However, urban life with all its complexities and hardships was never a central part of Viking society. The true desire of the Vikings of the Great Heathen Army was the vast and fertile agricultural lands of England. In 866, after taking York, Viking armies dispersed throughout northern England, seizing villages and appropriating farms. Over the next decade, the Vikings annexed entire kingdoms, defeating every army that opposed them, save for one. In the south, King Alfred the Great of Wessex managed to halt the Vikings near the town of Edington. This battle was the first in a long time that the Anglo-Saxons did not lose, and as a result, both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were ready for diplomatic negotiations. According to the Treaty of Wedmore, King Alfred ceded all territories north of the River Thames to the Vikings, which comprised almost half of what was then England. As they became firmly established in this territory, and Danish customs and laws took effect, this area became known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw soon transformed into an extremely attractive destination for Scandinavian settlers. However, unlike those who settled in, for example, Normandy, the Vikings brought their families, as well as their language and rich culture. Traveling through the countryside around modern York, one can pass through villages whose names date back to Viking times. Their place names contain Old Norse elements, and, as researchers are now beginning to understand, many of them were actually founded during the period of Viking rule. Governed by local assemblies known as things, or all things, the Vikings of the Danelaw left a profound mark on the English legal and administrative system, for instance, evidenced by the emergence of the 12-man jury institution. This system involved Vikings appointing 12 people to represent one side or the other in resolving a dispute. As in other territories held by the Norsemen, the Vikings of the Danelaw gradually began to integrate with the local population. Old English and Old Norse were mutually intelligible, facilitating communication. They likely conversed freely with each other, and an Anglo-Saxon might reside in one part of the valley while a Viking lived in another. Marriages occurred between families of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon descent. The two languages also began to merge. Many words and phrases of Viking origin were adopted by the English, as were certain aspects of Viking culture. For example, the celebration of the Yule log is based on an ancient pagan Viking ceremony, and the figure of Father Christmas represents a Christianized version of an ancient Viking hero. By the end of the 10th century, the vast majority of Vikings living in England had converted to Christianity. The result of this conversion was a weakening of ties with their homeland and a noticeable reduction in the intensity of Viking raids throughout the British Isles. But why did the Vikings so readily convert to a new faith? One reason was the harsh and fatalistic nature of the Viking religion. The end of the world in Viking mythology was called Ragnarok, and this concept signified the inevitable doom of the gods. Norse mythology significantly differs from most mythologies in that it inherently assumes the gods will be destroyed by their enemies. Usually, the opposite occurs. Thus, the gods were not immortal beings. Although local cults harmoniously blended with the veneration of the main gods common throughout Scandinavia. Among them were Odin, the god of war, Thor, the god of thunder and sky, and the main fertility gods Freyr and Freya, who were a twin pair. Women typically worshipped Freya, and men, Freyr, and these deities were also associated with the fertility of fields and the fruitfulness of the family. Overall, the Viking pantheon of gods was a grim and at times merciless community, whose cults demanded bloody sacrifices, not only of animals but also of humans. There is a historical chronicle describing a pagan ceremony held in 10th century Uppsala, Sweden, which attests to a terrible event. 99 human lives were sacrificed in a single day. However, such brutal aspects of pagan belief soon began to be rejected by their neighbors, the English and the French. Such rejection undoubtedly negatively impacted trade and political ties. It became evident that Christianity was gradually becoming the accepted norm. By the early 11th century, specifically by 1000 AD, practically everyone with power in northwestern Europe had already embraced Christianity. Those who continued to adhere to pagan beliefs found themselves marginalized not only religiously but also economically and politically. Thus, the widespread conversion to Christianity, once it became firmly established, was one of the key reasons for the decline of the Viking Age. But in England, the final blow was delivered by a long-standing and well-known adversary, the Norman conquest of 1066. This event instantly transformed England into a centralized monarchy, modeled on the French system, and officially marked the end of the Viking Age. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, which immortalized the Battle of Hastings, vividly depicts English King Harold Godwin's son losing his kingdom and his very life. William the Bastard, the victorious Duke of Normandy, a direct descendant of the legendary Viking Rollo, forever entered history as William the Conqueror. Ultimately, it is quite ironic that it was this man, of Viking descent, who brought the French language and, to a large extent, French culture to England. Upon closer inspection of the Bayeux Tapestry, one can observe that while the Normans are depicted in typical French armor and with French weaponry, their ships retain the distinctive Viking design. While the Viking Age in England was drawing to a close, in the harsh north, in Iceland, a new chapter was just beginning, the era of the Icelandic sagas. This was a time filled with distant adventures and incredible hardships. As a curious historical experiment, in 1963, Danish Boy Scouts built an exact replica of a Viking warship. One of the goals of this undertaking was to test whether such a ship could carry horses, as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. The results were impressive. The vessel effortlessly transported both horses and the scouts themselves across the open sea. Thus, even as the era of Viking dominance in England came to an end, another Viking society was born and thrived in the harsh North Iceland. To this day, Viking history and culture remain exceptionally vibrant in Iceland. It is the only place where the Old Norse language has been preserved almost in its pristine form. Deep within an underground vault beneath the Arni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik lies a true treasure trove of stories, the history of the Viking Age, recounted by the Vikings themselves, the Icelandic sagas. The Vikings were unparalleled storytellers. Long nights and endless winters fostered the development of this art, and it is known that they regularly told stories at home and in their camps. The sagas constitute one of the richest and most distinctive literary traditions of medieval Europe. Recorded on parchment, finely scraped calfskin, the sagas are not only family chronicles but also captivating narratives of wars, blood feuds, and dangerous voyages to uncharted lands. Many sagas tell of territories discovered purely by chance when people's ships were blown off course. One such saga recounts a Norseman named Floki, who set sail in 860 with the hope of establishing a new settlement. The traditional story of how Iceland got its name is associated with an unpleasant surprise for one of the early explorers who expected to find a warm and welcoming place. According to tradition, he was unable to gather enough fodder for his animals for the first winter, and then, seeing the land still covered in snow, gave the country its current name, which today seems quite unfair. However, Floki was not deterred by Iceland's harsh name. By 870, as literary sources report, a great wave of immigration to Iceland began. This was one of the largest migrations of people across the Atlantic. Between 10,000 and 20,000 people arrived here over 60 years, seeking to escape the monarchies that were asserting their power in Scandinavia. The independent Vikings of Iceland created their own system of governance. In 930, one of the first fully democratic assemblies in the history of Western Europe was born, the Icelandic Althing. The Althing convened for 2 weeks in June each year, and all chieftains of Iceland, with their followers of free men who then served as judges, were obliged to attend this assembly. This bustling Viking festival, the Althing, was held amidst the majestic red lava cliffs of Thingvellir, a volcanic rift located near Reykjavik. This was a natural and, in many ways, magical place where people from all over Iceland gathered to settle disputes, resolve land claims, arrange marriages, and conduct business. It was an extremely vibrant and dynamic hub. However, as their island became increasingly overpopulated, the Norse began to face significant challenges. By the end of the century, Iceland was a vastly different place. According to written sources, Iceland was once covered with forests from the mountains to the sea. It was a place where pigs could be freely released into birch groves, whereas today not a single tree can be found for hundreds of miles around. In 970 AD, a century after the initial settlement, Iceland experienced a widespread famine. Sagas recount that food became so scarce that people were forced to eat refuse. Around the same time, a young, red-haired Viking arrived in Iceland, fleeing a death sentence for killing a man in Norway. Eric the Red is an excellent example of the archetypal Viking Age individual. He was a persistent, aggressive, and greedy man who eventually became a renowned and wise leader. But Eric's aggressive nature made him an outcast in Iceland as well. After killing a neighbor in a feud, Eric was banished from Iceland for 3 years. Hearing reports of a new land sighted to the west, Eric immediately set out to find it. For several months, Eric and his crew explored the ice-covered coast of what they initially thought was a large peninsula, but they found no suitable place for settlement until they rounded its southern tip. Here, along the western coast, they discovered pristine pastures and sheltered, ice-free fjords. In 986 AD, after 3 years of exploration, Eric triumphantly returned to Iceland. As described in Eric the Red saga, Eric found a way to successfully colonize the land he discovered, for he claimed people would be far more eager to go there if the land had an appealing name. In the late 900s, Icelanders faced widespread soil erosion. The idea of a new Greenland, with fresh pastures, must have been enormously and undeniably appealing. However, the 500-mile voyage proved perilous. Of the approximately 700 brave men and women who accompanied Eric on his journey to Greenland shores, only about 400 reached their destination. 11 of the 25 ships either turned back or were lost forever to the sea. The surviving colonists settled in two distinct areas, the eastern settlement near Cape Farewell and the western settlement 300 miles further up the coast. Eric, who chose a farm called Brattahlid for himself, meaning steep slope farm, whose ruins still survive in southern Greenland, undoubtedly owned some of the most fertile lands in the region. Eric's wife, Jodhild, converted to Christianity and refused marital relations with him. This deeply troubled Eric, but she eventually managed to build a church near their homestead, the remains of which are still visible today. Despite all hardships, by 1000 AD, the Greenlandic colonies were thriving and even exporting their unique products to Europe. Polar bears were particularly popular, and in the Middle East, white Arctic falcons were highly prized as birds of prey. Around the same time, according to ancient sagas, another brave Norse seafarer set out once more to explore new horizons. His name was Leif Erikson. Leif was Eric's son. It is uncertain whether Leif was born in Iceland or Greenland. Perhaps he moved with his father to Greenland when he was a small boy. Like his father, he also had an insatiable urge for unexplored territories to the west. Like his parent, Leif followed reports of land sighted to the west. He outfitted 3 well-prepared vessels and set sail into the unknown. The Norse did not perceive their discoveries as finding an entirely new world. They found what they expected to see, a chain of lands encircling a central vast sea, believing that if one continued, they would eventually return to where they started. After traversing the waters of the Davis Strait, Leif Erikson first set foot on a rocky shore, presumably Baffin Island, now part of Canada. He named this land Helgeland, which translates to Land of Flat Stones. Moving further south, the expedition discovered a coastline densely covered with forest. Leif named it Markland, or Forest Land. This is almost certainly the forested coast of Labrador. However, the location of their next stop has sparked much heated debate. Here, as the sagas recount, the Norse found an abundant land, dotted with numerous trees, sprawling grassy meadows, and rivers teeming with salmon. Leif and his men decided to winter there and built a temporary camp of sod structures. One day, while some of the men were conducting reconnaissance, they discovered wild grapes growing in the forest. Astonished by this unusual discovery, Leif named this territory Vinland. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Vinland discussions is the etymology of the place name itself. However, there is a difficulty. Wild grapes do not grow north of the St. Lawrence River. Furthermore, the waters of the St. Lawrence River and adjacent southern areas are too warm for Atlantic salmon. Such discrepancies in the sagas have led to theories that Vinland might have been as far south as Cape Cod. It should be noted that the Old Norse word for meadow is pronounced Vinland, with a short vowel, as opposed to Vinland, with a long vowel, which means grape land. Therefore, Vinland should be understood as land of meadows or pastures, and not at all as wineland. By the late 1950s, the distinguished archaeologist Helge Ingstad, along with his wife, began searching for evidence of Viking presence on the North American continent. Guided by the descriptions in the sagas, they sailed along the eastern coast of Canada, seeking a location with characteristics similar to the described Vinland. Their investigations eventually led them to the northern tip of Newfoundland, to a place known as Lanceaux Meadows, which literally translates to the meadows. Here, the Ingstads discovered the foundations of nearly a dozen sod structures, built in typical Norse style. Further evidence of the site's Viking origin was found when they unearthed 2 miniature artifacts, a pin used to fasten a cloak at the shoulder, and a spindle whorl, a tool used for spinning wool. Both items, without a doubt, matched Viking design. Could these finds point to Vinland itself and the ruins of the houses described in the ancient sagas? Most experts agree that the settlement at Lanceaux Meadows was merely a temporary Norse stopping point on their way to Vinland, located further south. It certainly was not a permanent settlement, as one of its most important aspects is the brevity of its occupation. It is quite clear that it was occupied for no more than a few years, perhaps about a decade. And the Norse settlement at Lanceaux Meadows, like other Norse settlements, ultimately failed in the long term. According to the sagas, up to 4 additional expeditions were made to Vinland. All of them were repeatedly interrupted due to fierce clashes with those the Norse called Skrælings, which literally translates from Old Norse as wretches or scraps. It is presumed that this term encompassed both the Thule culture Inuit of Canada and various indigenous North American tribes. In one battle with the Skrælings, Leif Erikson's brother, Thorvald, fell at the hand of one of the natives. The last accounts of Leif indicate that he returned to Greenland to take over the leadership of the colony from his father. He dedicated the remainder of his days to preaching Christianity. Here the saga's narrative ends. However, did the Vikings leave these lands forever? Some controversial evidence suggests that the Vikings may have ventured even further in their explorations. Notably, the names of some modern weekdays are inherited from Norse gods. Wednesday is named after Odin, the father of all gods, Thursday after Thor, the god of thunder, and Friday after Freyr, the lord of peace and fertility. In 1355 AD, centuries after Leif Erikson's death, a priest from Greenland's eastern settlement undertook a journey to visit the church of the smaller western community, located 300 miles further up the coast. Father Ivar Barderson was troubled by reports that this small community was in decline, possibly due to attacks by the Inuit. However, when Father Barderson arrived at the site, he was met by no one. The small settlement, which had endured extreme weather conditions and incredible remoteness for 350 years, had vanished without a trace. No bodies were found, no traces of blood, no signs of battle or human presence. Having reached Greenland and then the North American continent, the Norse found themselves at the very limits of their connections with their homeland. Their numbers were insufficient to successfully resist the indigenous peoples of America, and even to sustain the Norse colony in Greenland. Their strength was lacking. But if they didn't perish there, where did they go? Over the last 200 years, intriguing evidence has begun to emerge, pointing to a possible Viking presence somewhere on the North American continent. But were these clues authentic, or were they clever hoaxes? In the early 1900s, Canadian Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson recounted an encounter with an Inuit tribe living on Ellesmere Island, just a few hundred miles from Greenland. This in itself was not extraordinary, but these Inuit had light hair and blue eyes, traits characteristic of the Norse gene pool. In the 19th and 20th centuries, there was genuine interest in the fate of the last Norse settlers of Greenland and the colony as a whole. One theory suggested they assimilated with the Inuit of Greenland. Other evidence suggested that the vanished Vikings might have traveled south, ending up in an area that is now part of Minnesota. In 1898, a Norwegian immigrant named Olaf Oman claimed to have discovered a Viking runestone on his farm in Kensington, Minnesota. It bore an inscription supposedly left by a lost Viking expedition in the region. But subsequent examination of both the stone itself and the language of the inscription indicates that it is likely a forgery made by the farmer. The Kensington stone became the subject of heated debate, fueled by a deep desire amongst Scandinavian Americans in the United States, perhaps to justify their presence in North America. The most compelling evidence found in the United States is a late 11th century Norse penny, discovered in a cultural layer, which was a refuse pit of an indigenous camp in Maine. How this coin came to be in this indigenous village and refuse pit is a fascinating story in itself, as it dates to a good half-century after the Lansayex Meadow settlement ended. Its later date suggests continued contact. However, the fragile ties between the Norse colonies of Iceland and Greenland could not endure. By 1450 AD, Iceland had completely lost contact with the remaining eastern settlement of Greenland. The period from 1300 to 1600 is often referred to as the Little Ice Age. The danger to seafarers came not only from fierce storms but also from drift ice, small but extremely hazardous pieces of ice drifting down from the northern coasts. Greenland suffered immensely from climate change, but it persisted as the last outpost of Norse culture outside Scandinavia. True traditional Norse culture continues to exist where Norse settlers, men, women, children, all formed the majority of the population, such as in the northern Orkney, Shetland, Faroe Islands, and Iceland. On these perpetually windswept islands, archaeologists are painstakingly piecing together some of the puzzles of Viking life. These stones, which can be seen here, are undoubtedly a monumental structure. When it was built and what its purpose was remains unknown at present. Black layers are also visible. These are layers of volcanic ash, called tephra. This layer almost certainly dates to the 1500s, when a powerful eruption occurred. But all the various chronological layers align with the ashfall, which is also found in Greenland, and ice core samples taken in Greenland are compared with the tephra. Thus, researchers have an outstanding system for chronological dating. This will reveal much about these stone structures. The indelible traces of the Norse, preserved in the volcanic soil of Iceland, or beneath the streets of York, or under the sod of Newfoundland, clearly demonstrate that the Vikings were far more than the merciless horde of plunderers depicted by medieval chroniclers. No more brutal than other warriors of their era, they were far more often farmers and fishermen, traders of goods from the most distant corners of the globe, and craftsmen of exceptional talent. Their unique style and visionary worldview left an indelible mark on the modern world. Their legacy lives within us. It permeates our being, our culture, the language we constantly use. If one wishes to know what a Viking looked like, one need only look in a mirror. Some historians claim that the sizes of Viking ships described in Norse literature were greatly exaggerated. However, in 1997, archaeologists discovered a magnificent longship at the bottom of a Danish harbor near Copenhagen. It is the largest ever found, measuring 120 feet long and capable of carrying 100 people. Experts suggest that the vessel perished during a storm, either en route to or returning from another Viking conquest.